Good evening. Tonight, we begin with something a little colder and far less romantic than the postcards. The complete history of the Titanic disaster. A tragedy forged by arrogance. Forget the Hollywood versions. This isn't a sweeping romance or a tidy rescue. It's a study in hubris, ignored warnings, and decisions that turned a marvel of engineering into a floating catastrophe. The truth is, you probably wouldn't have lasted a night aboard her when the ice met the hull. Survival came down to class, timing, and a handful of cruel chances. Before you settle in, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy this content. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always find it amazing to see our global audience come together. Now, dim the lights, and let's step into the cold April night that changed everything. In the opening years of the 20th century, the Atlantic was not merely a stretch of cold water between continents. It was a stage on which nations, companies and captains acted out their claims to modernity, to empire, to wealth. Steam and still rewrote what was possible, and the ritual crossing between Liverpool and New York became a contest for more than punctuality. It became a contest of symbols. Britain's Cunard line measured supremacy in knots, in the blue ribbon that glinted like a medal on the hull of Mauretania and Lusitania. Germany's Norddeutscher Lloyd and Hamburg America sent their own great ironers across, bulging with emigrants and filled with the orchestral clatter of industrial might. And the White Star Line, old and respectable, measured itself in a different currency, grandeur. Prestige in that decade took many forms. Speed drew headlines and a school of engineers, but White Star, owned and managed by men such as Jay, Bruce Ismay, and served by the soft power of Harland and Wolff's William Peary, chose to measure worth in space and comfort, in the architecture of leisure floating on a tide of coal. The rivalry that swallowed the North Atlantic in those years was not a simple sprint. It was a tangled set of market strategies and national reputations. Cunard's answer to speed was engineering virtuosity. Parsons turbines, slender lines, and a daily average of miles that made them the envy of polite shipping columns in London and New York. The Blue Riband was a trophy not just for a line but for a nation, and it attracted governments as well as passengers. White Star's strategy, decided in corridors of corporate power and within the drawing offices of Harland and Wolff, was to refuse that particular race. Instead of faster boilers and a tighter schedule, they offered something else. Size and spectacle, the promise of steadiness, and a new arithmetic of profit. Larger hulls meant economies of scale, more passengers, more cargo, more steerable margin across the months of immigration from Europe to America. Volume was the safer bet than velocity, the argument went. It was an argument with financial logic and aesthetic ambitions. A single enormous vessel could present a floating hotel, public rooms, gilded and panelled, staircases that might appear in a London club, suites that rivaled the best Paris hotels, while carrying thousands with fewer departures, more predictable crews, and the steady hum of revenue. That decision to value mass and magnificence over the pursuit of raw speed was both a commercial insight and a cultural gambit. It signalled a confidence in British industrial capacity and in the authority of managerial foresight. It also pushed design choices and corporate priorities in directions that privileged the visible markers of prestige. Passengers would remember a sweeping first-class dining saloon, a timbered smoking room, a palm court with its glass and brass and sunlight. They would not notice the mechanical discretion of bulkheads or the precise arithmetic of lifeboat davits until much later. White Star's manifesto was subtle. The company would promise a new kind of Atlantic crossing, an experience rather than a merely rapid transit. Photographs, prospectuses, and dockside promenades became instruments of persuasion. They dramatised a modernity that was both comforting and showy. In such a climate, safety could be spoken of in technical reports and surveys and still be outstripped by the corporate yearning to be monumental. The ordering of the so-called Olympic class, the three sisters that would become Olympic, Titanic and Britannic, was the crystallisation of that strategy. Decisions made in boardrooms and in the drawing rooms of Harland and Wolff's massive shipyard on Queen's Island in Belfast translated into a programme of scale, a length that dwarfed older steamers, a beam that created broad promenades and social rooms, and the internal volume to carry the diverse traffic of first-class millionaires and steerage emigrants under the same smokestacks. Mauritania and Lusitania had the speed, and Cunard had the headlines. White Star would have palaces afloat and the economic steadiness of carrying many more souls per crossing. There was method in the ostentation. Deck plans optimised circulation and privacy. Cabins stacked like urban apartments, and third-class quarters were genuinely improved to attract paying emigrants in a market that had grown fiercely competitive. Still, the pursuit of prestige was not harmless ornament. It generated incentives that reshaped priorities. Deck-eye appeal mattered in the salesmanship of voyages. Fewer davits cluttered the promenade deck and preserved lines of sight and airy seating for first-class passengers. Lifeboats, always a pragmatic necessity, became into practice a design constraint rather than a defining feature. The company and its engineers trusted the new technologies, watertight compartments, double bottoms, steel plating, so fully that lifeboats were treated like a formal legal compliance rather than a practical guarantee. That trust fed a quieter arrogance. The belief that industry, fitted as it was with new calculations and new materials, had made catastrophe a poor business model and therefore an increasingly unlikely event. Commercial ambition and a desire for symbolic dominance, then, laid the cultural groundwork for risky assumptions about safety. When the sea finally asked its account, those assumptions would be tested in a most unforgiving currency. At Harland and Wolff, the scale of the ambition was visible in the landscape. Gantries like cathedral arches, slipways sunk into the mud of Belfast Lough, thousands of hands and a staggering blue-collar logistics. The keel of Titanic was laid down on an ordinary March day, 31st of March 1909, but the act was anything but ordinary, for it began the assembly of a Leviathan. Shipwrights ripped and bent steel in hot sparks, riveters hammered in rhythmic teams, and the yard's foreman coordinated the choreography of plates and frames with a kind of industrial reverence. Thomas Andrews, the man whose name would later be linked to both design brilliance and personal tragedy, ran the drawing office with meticulous attention to proportion and accommodation. He had been sent by Harland and Wolff as the designer in charge for the Olympic lineage, and oversaw each filament of scale that transformed paper into hull. His drawings insisted on public rooms that spoke of comfort, on long ranges of cabins, on the circulation that made the vessel feel like a small vertical city. The ship's internal architecture prized surfaces and sensations: oak panelling, gilded balustrades, marble, plush carpets, electric lighting designed like theatrical direction to charm the eye. The grand staircase was intended, very deliberately, to impress. A cascade of carved balusters, a dome that let in light, a clock watched by the well-dressed passengers. There were Turkish baths suited with heated stone and tiles, a gymnasium with rudimentary weight machines, a smoking room for men who liked to drink and sit and discuss stocks. The first-class dining saloon was long and low and deliberately reminiscent of a hotel. It could seat hundreds at tables laid out with starched linen and silver. Service had to be impeccable to justify the prices charged, so the ship carried a complement of officers and stewards trained to an international standard. At the same time, third-class accommodations, too often the afterthought on Victorian liners, were improved by design so that immigrant families might travel with dignity. The effect was deliberate, to seduce an aspirational clientele with the spectacle of civilized order. Beneath those rooms, however, lay compromises of structure and an engineering logic that did not, in the end, match the rhetoric of invulnerability. The hull was divided into a series of watertight compartments by transverse bulkheads, a technological salvation in theory. Those bulkheads were a marvel of early 20th century naval design, a latticework intended to confine damage. But their seals and their heights were calculated with specific scenarios in mind. Breaches limited to the bottom plating, punctures contained in a small number of adjoining compartments. The confidence placed in the bulkhead scheme included a reading of probabilities, It was thought unlikely that a single instant would perforate multiple adjacent compartments simultaneously along the hull. This kind of probabilistic faith is an engineer's necessary tool, but it is also an invitation to complacency when the world does not behave in the bounded ways the models presume. There was also the matter of how the watertight bulkheads were terminated. They did not rise through every deck. They stopped at certain levels where decks and openings were permitted that favoured ventilation and interior circulation. The arrangement made sense for comfort and for the way people moved through the ship, but it gave water a route if it came in excess of design expectations. The double bottom, another touted safety feature, ran along the keel but did not protect the entire flank of the hull above the waterline. It was a partial defence, not an impenetrable shell. On the construction floor, the attention that went into the aesthetic and social programmes, into trimming and panelling, into snug and equally sumptuous passenger spaces, was not always matched by a paranoia for redundant safety. Material science added its own silent limits. Millions of rivets, 3 million is the oft-quoted figure, joined the plates and framed the structure, and their manufacture and installation were feats of labour and coordination. The steel used for the hull and the iron in the rivets belonged to the supply chains of the Belfast industrial region. Excellent in many respects, but not uniform in metallurgical character. Later examinations of wreckage and surviving plates suggested that some materials might have become brittle in the Atlantic's cold, and that some rivets might have sheared under localised stress more easily than modern engineers would have liked. Whether such details were decisive is a matter for careful forensic debate. What matters for the historian's story is that the materials and the workmanship were fitted into a design philosophy that assumed a series of unlikely things would not all happen at once. The margin between confidence and catastrophe had been drawn thin by choices that favoured proportion, comfort, and the visual rhetoric of a grand ship. Those choices did not happen in a legal vacuum. Britain's maritime regulation at the time was a patchwork of statutes and customary practices that had not kept pace with the scale of the new liners. The Board of Trade, the governmental body responsible for merchant shipping, had rules, many of them codified in the Merchant Shipping Act and related instruments, that governed lifeboats, inspections and certificates. But those rules were designed for an earlier generation. Lifeboat regulations in particular used tonnage as a basis for required boat spaces, rather than passenger numbers or worst-case scenarios. They presumed a world of gradual improvements rather than a sudden leap in ship size. Consequently, a vessel built to the then-current rules could be legally compliant and still be woefully underprepared to save all aboard if things went badly. It bears repeating gently, Titanic sailed legally. The certificates were in order, surveys had been made, and the ship bore as required a number of lifeboats that exceeded the board's minimum. The compliance was used as proof of prudence and, perversely, as an argument against the need for more. Those inside the regulatory system could point to signatures and stamps, to forms filled and boxes ticked. What the forms did not capture were the qualitative changes brought by scale, how a 20,000 gross ton liner changed the arithmetic of survival. Regulatory lag had a human face. Officials who inspected ships accustomed to a half-dozen lifeboats did not immediately reimagine the consequences when a single ship carried 2,000 souls. Organisational culture compounded the problem. Within White Star, restraint and a certain managerial elegance were virtues. The company's image thrived on the persuasion that its ships were placid, reliable corridors across the ocean. To clutter a promenade deck with rows of lifeboats would have been a marketing mistake. To insist on more davits and a spec-by-spec emergency plan would have smelled of fear and inefficiency. There is a bitter kind of rationality in that calculation. Invest where customers notice, and maintain the minimum required where they do not. The economy of appearances thus nudged practical safety to the margins. Lifeboats became a balancing act between aesthetic lines and legal duties. Training and routine reflected the same institutional complacency. Captain Edward John Smith, an experienced master who had captained White Star steamers and was widely regarded as a model of steady command, preferred to trust in the ship and her systems. He expected Harland and Wolff's design and the Board of Trade's certification to embody a margin of safety. Lifeboat drills were, in practice, inadequate. The davits and launching procedures required practiced crews and clear command, neither of which were fully in place for a ship of that unprecedented size on her maiden voyage. The men charged with lowering the lifeboats had never in normal operations launched a full complement at sea. The mechanisms were heavy, the boats large, and the choreography involved precise syncing between officers and deckhands. When the moment of crisis arrived, the absence of rehearsal would reveal itself as a procedural failure as much as a technical one. Boats were launched half empty, instructions delayed. The human systems that should have steadied the chaos had been treated as contingencies rather than core competencies. Technological hubris found a partner in communication practices. The wireless telegraphy aboard was modern and so brave that many favoured it for its novelty. Marconi sets on ocean liners were both a service for passengers and a navigational instrument. On Titanic, the Marconi room was manned by skilled operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, who sent and received a flood of messages, including ice warnings from other ships. These warnings arrived across the day, from steamers that had encountered bergs or fields of pack ice, from captains who judged conditions treacherous. Yet the chain of communication between the radio room and the bridge was porous with priorities. Passenger messages, social telegrams, and the commercial traffic that Marconi operators could send for a fee often competed with meteorological and navigational information. The technology itself could have reduced risk, but it relied on institutional rules, who read what to whom and when, that were not codified strongly enough to outrank the routines of commerce. And there was another human factor, the culture of command and competition. Captains of great liners were men under social and business pressure, not merely to be safe but to be punctual. Schedules mattered to agents in Southampton and New York, to the press, to corporate profit, and to passengers who would connect with trains and ferries at the far side. The pressure to maintain schedule could lead to decisions that flirted with danger. Sailing through an ice field at speed was an attitude, a judgment about trade-offs. It is easy with hindsight to think that caution would have been the obvious course. In the moment, though, there were reasons, financial, reputational, personal, that inclined masters and managers to trust in craft and calculation. This is the architecture of arrogance, the belief that experience, design and law had made the worst contingencies unlikely, and that to give up schedule and appearance was to admit vulnerability. The regulatory aftermath confirmed some of these diagnoses. When the North Atlantic registered its harsh accounting for hubris in the spring of 1912, inquiries were convened both in Britain and in the United States. Public hearings sifted testimony, examined designs, and argued about the wisdom of rules that measured safety by tonnage alone. Those investigations were technical, moral, and political. They exposed the gaps between legal compliance and practical sufficiency. Out of that scrutiny came concrete reforms. Lifeboat provisions were to be rethought so every person aboard a vessel could have a seat. Radio watches were to be continuous, not discretionary, and distress protocols were clarified. And international mechanisms were created to patrol and chart the iceberg-filled routes of the North Atlantic so that no captain could plead total ignorance of seasonal danger. The International Ice Patrol, established under American auspices with international support, became one small institutional remedy to a problem that had been treated as local and intermittent, rather than systemic and seasonal. The economics of safety too altered in consequence. What had been a line item in a shipping ledger? Extra davits. The cost of more lifeboats, the encroachment of clutter on promenades, suddenly became a headline and a moral obligation. The language of costs had to accommodate human life in a way mutually agreed by states and companies. The maritime world would slowly move toward a doctrine that treated redundancy, not as aesthetic loss, but as an investment in continuity. That was the practical lesson, and it was hard won. 6 weeks after the ship left Southampton on her maiden voyage, after the shock had worked itself into the public imagination, commentators would point to human error, to a captain's judgment, to a company chairman's priorities, and to a designer's misreading of potential ruptures. They would also point, with more accumulated sobriety, to the way regulatory instruments had fallen behind industrial practice, to the cadence of commerce that prized spectacle and comfort. and to a corporate culture that had found it easy to lean on formal compliance rather than cultivate the kinds of redundancies that survive the extraordinary. The sea had tested the confidence of a civilization that liked to think itself masters of its machines. It found them wanting. In quieter reflection, and in the hush that precedes sleep, the story of that race for the Atlantic reads like a parable of modernity. Great resources marshalled to produce an experience, managers and engineers choosing which risks to bear and which to accept as regulated by law and custom. A population persuaded by promises of magnificence. The logistical genius of Belfast's yards, the eloquence of the ship's public rooms, the willing complicity of passengers attracted by the spectacle, these were all parts of the same cultural artifact. From a distance, the Titanic looked and felt like progress. Up close, in the cold and the dark, the seams between design and catastrophe were revealed. If there is a final irony, it is that the very things that made the ship desirable, her scale, her luxury, her capacity, were also the vectors by which delay and insufficiency amplified. A larger ship meant that what had once been an adequate number of boats would no longer suffice. More passengers meant more variable human behaviour to organise in crisis, and the theatricality of public spaces made it more likely that decoration would outrank redundancy in design meetings. The White Star Line's vision of an Atlantic dominated by majestic floating palaces was ingenious, commercially astute, and historically resonant. But that vision also contained within it a modest calculus of human fallibility and a regulatory complacency that history would, in due and terrible course, reckon. What followed the tragedy was not only grief and investigation, but a slow architectural rewriting of safety. Wood and brass and marble remained beautiful, but the new era insisted that they sit upon a foundation of redundancy and preparedness that could be tested in dark hours. Laws were changed, habits altered, and practices institutionalized. The ocean did not forget, and neither did the bureaucrats and builders who had once thought that scale and spectacle made them immune to the caprices of cold water and iron rivets. They learned, as businesses often learn, through a costly feedback loop. The lesson was ancient and sharp. When ambition outpaces prudence, the ledger of consequences grows long. Gentle as the sea may sometimes be, it keeps a meticulous account. When the great hull of the Titanic slid away from the timbers and grease of Harland and Wolff on the morning of May 31st, 1911, Belfast shipyard chimneys seemed to exhale a proud fog that drifted over the luff and into the newspapers of the world. Men in oil-splattered coats, clerks in starched collars, and civic dignitaries watched as rivets and plate met sea for the first time. The city that had birthed so many iron colossi celebrated another. The ship herself, hull number 401, the largest moving piece of human industry the British Isles had produced, looked, in that first watery cradle, like a promise made visible. A promise of solace, of comfort, of engineering insolence. Harland and Wolff's worksmen had spent months hammering out seams the size of a house. Thomas Andrews, the quiet man with the drafts on his desk, and drawings that showed 16 watertight compartments, each bulkhead always rising like a shelf across the great breadth of the vessel. J. Bruce Ismay, the white-shirted head of White Star's holding company, walked the decks with the polite impatience of a man who traded in timetables and reputations. Sir William Peary, of Harland and Wolff, hands stained with oil and paperwork, clasped elbows with journalists and financiers and allowed the cameras their picture of modernity. The aircraft of the age was the ship, and Titanic was showier than most, not fast enough to win races, not small enough to be modest, but designed to seat luxury and carry cargo and passengers across the North Atlantic in a manner that tasted of permanence. The launch was, in its way, a kind of liturgy for the industrial age. There was no single thunderclap of discovery, but a long sequence of mechanical certainties, the ways greased and molten with soap, the shouts of foremen, the cheering of a crowd that included people who expected their leisure to be improved and people who expected, more quietly, fortune. The ship would go to sea, they said, and the sea would have to learn some new manners. In the months that followed the fitting out, amid the carpeting and the chandeliers being hoisted into position, a more intimate and technical ritual was arranged: the sea trials. These were not parades, they were exacting instrumented tests, run by engineers and officers who loved numbers and charts and the measured satisfaction of a graph that conformed to prediction. The trials took place in early April 1912 after the Titanic had been provisioned and her systems turned to a human hum. On those waters off the coast of Ireland, with the technical spectators aboard, Ismay Andrews, Captain Edward J. Smith among them, the ship was pushed, turned and examined. Sea trials are, if you listen closely, an affair of modest brutality. Steam pressure is increased not to flirt with danger, but to measure the margin between what the hull will take and what causes failure. A rudder is spun through arc after arc to see how the hull responds. Propellers are tested for cavitation and torque. Pumps are run dry and refed. The cameras of the day later published photographs of the senior men smiling, hands in pockets, eyes on dials. The ship's measured performance satisfied the men who mattered. Titanic reached the speeds and the handling. White Star contracted for. The boilers and engines behaved. The watertight doors cycled. The luxurious public rooms tolerated their own ornament without showing stress. Journalists sent dispatches shaded with that special reverence reserved for triumphs of machine and imperial commerce. Reports in London and New York remarked on the elegance of the dining saloon, the novelty of electric lifts, the Turkish baths in the billiard room, the solidity of the hull, the newness of the Marconi wireless equipment. Commentators, pleased to find something new to narrate in a world that liked its progress neat, wrote, without much hesitation, of a vessel engineered with the latest science. A floating palace that carried, by design and by advertisement, an implicit guarantee. That guarantee was, in truth, a form of hubris dressed as empiricism. The sea trials measured performance in calm and planned conditions. They tested handling in clear weather, the responsiveness of the engines when given orders, and the reliability of pumps when filled and emptied by men who knew the checklists. They did not test how the ship would behave when one side of her hull was ripped open by a shelf of ice in the dark of an April night, or when an officer had to marshal passengers through a social order that had been carefully drawn into the ship's plans. They were not, and could not be, designed to simulate every combination of misfortune, but they were sufficient to produce a public atmosphere of confidence that was both corporate and popular. Insurance underwriters noted the statistics approvingly. The travelling classes, those who could afford to taste the best of modernity, liked the idea that the boat had been proven. The newspapers, always hungry for headline and spectacle, took the technical confidence and rendered it into simpler language. Marvel, Unsinkable. Names were attached to the machine. Titanic was a thing that would not, as some gently insolent cartoonists put it, sink easily. The more the machinery worked in trial, the more narrative took the shape of a promise. When the ship steamed out of Southampton on April 10th, 1912, there would be no shortage of expectation to make her heavy. Southampton's docks, the city that stitched together every liner's face to the world, was crowded with family, clerks, porters, and the curious who wanted to see a modern legend begin its crossing. The passenger list read like a cross-section of a changing world. Captains of industry and men whose surnames were synonyms for million-dollar estates. Second-class teachers and clerks. Steerage passengers. Emigrant households whose futures lay across an ocean. And a crew numbering in the hundreds who, if they wished, would later insist that the ship among them was a city. The vessel itself had been designed precisely to be such a city. There were promenades for the first class to walk in the sun, a smoking room and library aft, a grand staircase rising like a stage set, and a lattice of corridors below decks that held the practical life of the ship. Bunk rooms for the second and third classes, galleys, engine stalls, coal bunkers, and the noisy, warm kingdom of the stokers. On one level, this was an architectural achievement, to put under one roof so many forms of domestic life, so many different expectations, and to separate them with doors, staircases, and ticketed spaces. The social geography of Titanic was deliberate, exact, and immutable. First-class ticket holders paid not only for the bed or the meal, but for a position on the ship's map. They had the contiguous routes to dining saloons and promenade decks, the elevators and the smoking rooms, the private staircases that gently layered their lives above the general flow. Second class contained the respectable, the professional classes who sought comfort without unnecessary fanfare. Their dining rooms were modest, their accommodations practical, and their social spheres well ordered. Third class, labelled steerage in older parlance, but by 1912 often simply third class, were primarily emigrants en route to the United States. Families, single men and women who carried trunks of hope and desperation. They were clustered on the lower decks, often forward, in a part of the ship that was separate in access and in law. In steamship architecture of that time, the separation of classes was not merely a matter of comfort, but also of legal and sanitary regulation. Immigrants were sifted and inspected. Their rails to the world were separate. Folded into that separation were practical realities. From the promenade deck to the steerage mess, there were gates to be opened, card systems to be checked, and the often invisible, almost architectural assertion that some people would not casually wander into others' social spaces. That geography mattered when the night turned. Doors and stairwells were not neutral features, they were filters. First-class passengers, positioned near a boat deck staircases and forward with visible access to muster stations, found it easier to obey an evacuation order when one came, and to present themselves to crew with obvious claims to space. Stewards could say, "This way, madam," and the direction led where the stewards intended. Third-class passengers, many of whom were below decks and whose first language was not English, had to navigate the ship's interior with lists and porters often in the dark. Testimony after the disaster would describe the confusion. Gates that required a certain key, staircases that emptied into storerooms, and the sense of being underground in the belly of a luxury machine. The social design became, under pressure, a barrier. Men and women behaved as their positions, and the ship's design allowed. Wealth provided mobility and access to information. First-class men had the means to hire servants, to purchase cabins with internal telephones, and to gain audience with officers or with the Marconi wireless operators when desired. The latter point mattered more than people at the turn of the century might have calculated. The radio room, though small and technical, sat near the social heart of the ship's operations. It was the node where news arrived from cities and other ships, and where messages could be sent to the shore for a fee. The Marconi operators, Jack Phillips and his assistant Harold Bride, sat there like conductors of a small essential orchestra. They could, at a moment's notice, move a message from one person to another, and they could also, when pushed by the demands of affluent passengers, prioritise certain dispatches that brought them coin and attention. The operators belonged to an independent company and carried the little authority of technicians in a ship organised around rank and ticket class. They were rightly proud of their work. They were also something of a commerce inside a commerce. Crew identity was itself a stratified map. The engineers and stokers lived and worked in the ship's furnace heart. Their stations were hot and wet and below decks. Their work was physically central to the ship's movement and habitability. Yet it was also a place where the rules were different, less social space, more muscle and heat. The officers, with charts and compasses, occupied a bridge high above the deck, making navigational decisions. The stewards, silent in their clipped uniforms, were the connective tissue between passengers and the machinery of the ship's comfort. Those structures of duty determined where each person would be when crisis first arrived, and they would, as often as not, determine whether someone reached a lifeboat or a locked hatch. When the iceberg warnings began to stack up on April 14, 1912, the distribution of information, who knew what, when and where, became crucial. In the long afternoon and early evening before the collision, Titanic's Marconi room recorded and transmitted several warnings from other vessels that reported ice. Messages came from ships that had been steaming ahead and found fields and bergs. The transatlantic wireless network, though young, was already a web. Ships spoke to ships, and ships spoke to shore stations at Cape Race in Newfoundland, and to operators in Halifax and Britain. The messages varied in tone and specificity. Some were stark and urgent, others more casual, reports of growlers and heavy pack ice, and the positions in latitude and longitude where large bergs had been sighted. Mesaba, a freighter then crossing roughly east-west, sent a clear report indicating a significant body of ice in the area that Titanic would be transiting that night. The Baltic and the America and other liners, older and newer, sent similar cautions through the morning and afternoon. How those warnings were handled reveals much about the human systems and the latent arrogance that so often accompanies technological mastery. The Marconi wireless operators had a dual set of obligations to their technical employer and to the social network of passengers whose messages purchased their attention. On Titanic, Phillips had been keeping up a steady stream of passenger traffic and messages to Cape Race. The backlog fascinated as much as it frustrated. The working culture of the wireless room, paid messages, pride in a clear signal, the social force of keeping first-class patrons content, inclined the operators to work the list. When Cyril Evans, the operator of the nearby SS Californian, attempted to raise Titanic to warn that his ship had stopped because of the cold pack and extensive ice, the response he received from Phillips was brusque, and the exchange has become a small bitter legend. There was irritation, refusal of time, and a curt insistence that Cape Race was being worked. Evans turned his set off and secured his cabin. Californian then drifted in a field of ice with her lights showing and burners banked, while her crew kept watch. That exchange, and others like it, were not singular errors so much as a culture in which the radio had not been fully integrated into navigation and safety procedures. The wireless certificate and its operators were new to the maritime chain of command. Their priority was often commercial rather than navigational. A message placed eagerly, as a cable might, into their hands brought fees and attention. A navigational warning written by an officer on another ship and sent as a report could be left to habit and triage. It is important to recognise that the messages were sometimes written down, sometimes logged, and sometimes they travelled only in the ether. They could be heard or missed, recorded or delayed. The maritime inquiries that followed the Titanic's sinking would highlight that some messages had been logged but not brought to the captain's attention. The Mesaba message in particular would be examined with an almost forensic patience, because it told of a line of ice in the latitude and longitude that intersected Titanic's planned track. The record shows that it was received at Cape Race and then relayed, but whether it was placed into the ship's officers' hands in time to change course remains contested. What is less contestable is the pattern, chain after chain of small frictions, a message noted but not delivered, an operator too busy with passenger traffic, a signal seen in the dark and misread, conspired to build a blind stretch of the night. There is a cruelty to the machinery of miscommunication. It is composed of ordinary acts that, piled together, become extreme. A wireless operator concentrating on paid telegrams, a captain who trusts his bridge to keep him informed, an officer who assumes that warnings from other ships must be qualified, a ship's schedule that presses for speed and punctuality, and the sea itself, which gives no notice that the field in front of a moving vessel is compact enough to sneak a berg under the waterline. At night, the lookout's eyes were the final technical safeguard. They are, of course, limited by darkness and by the conditions of sea and sky. Worse, they lack binoculars. The key to the locker that contained them is a small bureaucratic anecdote worth pause. The binoculars were stored, but the key was not in the tower that night. Someone misplaced it. The men in the crow's nest scanned the dark with only naked eyes. Then the rockets. A brief, terrible punctuation. When Titanic struck, white rockets were fired into the lifeless cold above the ocean, a visual appeal through a sky that did not have to work to ignore it. Witnesses on a ship that had stopped in the ice saw them, flashes of punctuation in the dark. The Californian's crew saw them. Some thought them to be company signals, a request to rejoin, or a message of other, less fatal business. The precise code for distress rockets was not universally enforced, as a standard that would be immediately recognised in every situation. The Californian's captain, Stanley Lord, would insist later that his ship could not have reached Titanic in time or that signals were ambiguous. The British and American inquiries were less forgiving. They asked whether a vessel with her lights visible and within sight could, by shifting course and steaming up steam, have reached scenes where persons were marooned and perhaps saved some lives. Critics asked whether the ship that saw should have acted. Defenders calculated distances and speeds and offered counterfactuals that, in their arithmetic, might reduce culpability. Meanwhile, in the smoky intensity of the Marconi room, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride kept working. They sent out the ship's distress as wireless signals, initially with the telegraphic CQD, and then with the newly adopted SOS, the letters that carried urgency around the world. Their work mattered. It established the chain that would call Carpathia, under Captain Arthur Rostron, to the scene, and that would bring survivors into a dawn that smelled of coal smoke and warmed tea. But the early warnings, Baltic, America, Mesaba, Coronia and others, had not been unified into a decisive voice that night. Some had been written in logbooks, some had been noted and filed, some had simply been spoken and forgotten as other, more immediate tasks consumed hands and attention. The result was a field of missed messages, a sea of small friction points that produced a single, terrible outcome. An enormous ship, built to the confidence of sea trials and modern designs, moved at speed through an old danger and struck a hazard it had not fully been warned of. All of this, the elaborate launch ritual, the dry confidence of the sea trials, the mapping of human life into strict social strata, the scatter of warnings and the failures of communication, converges into a single uneasy lesson about scale and complacency. Titanic was an operating system of human decisions and mechanical certainties, and in that system the ordinary business of attention, what to answer and what to shelve, whom to wake and whom to ignore, proved decisive. The sea had its own indifference. Human institutions carried their own blind spots. A trial that proved performance in calm conditions became, to public reading, proof of permanence. A wireless room that was an engine of convenience became, because of habits of work and the incentive structures of cable fees, a place where urgent navigational warnings sometimes waited too long. A ship whose staircases polished the social order found those staircases transformed into bottlenecks when time accelerated and the ocean opened its old wounds. So the maiden voyage, filled with passengers who embodied the old social geographies of money, hope and obligation, slid into history under a sky that would not condescend. The wealthy and the poor boarded the same hull and were separated by the social designs that made certain choices simple and others almost impossible. That structure shaped who received information when it arrived, who had mobility to move toward the life-saving side of the ship, and who, by being physically lower or socially invisible, encountered delay after delay. And the wireless network, that very thing which in other moments promised to shrink distance and knit the world with a series of dots and dashes, was here revealed in its youthful, fragile state, capable of miraculous rescue yet still prone to human triage, personal priorities, and the slow gravity of habit. The post-disaster narrative, when it hardened, chose its heroes and its culprits along those same lines. Wealth and celebrity supplied faces and stories that were easy for a press to print. Guilt and managerial proximity supplied faces to blame. Ismay, who had been at the centre of both the ship's forging and her voyage, became a symbol in the papers of the man who had allowed or even encouraged speed. Captain Smith, the reliable old sea dog, became a martyr for some and a symbol of the establishment for others. The emigrant dead, whose names were many and whose photographs did not fit tidily into the pages, with line drawings of grand saloons, disappeared into lists and census reports. The wireless operators' names, recorded more clearly in inquiries that would follow, stood for the possibility of salvation and for the friction of new technology. The Californian, with its light showing and its operator asleep and its captain later left to answer question, became a lesson in the moral weight of seeing and acting. And the sea trials, for all their measured graphs and smiling men, remained a quiet example of how a successful test can, if not properly understood, become the occasion for overconfidence. There is a dark, almost mischievous irony in the way modernity behaves. It builds vast instruments to reduce the world's uncertainty, and then arranges social practices that reintroduce precisely those uncertainties. The Titanic was, in its fitting and trials, a vast exercise in reducing chance, the nod to science, the assurance of watertight compartments, the cosmetic and practical comforts of an ocean liner. Yet it sailed into a night where the human systems that surrounded it paid messages before warnings, keys misplaced, rockets misread, and ships anchored in ice that hesitated to act produced a different calculation. In the quiet that follows these considerations, where numbers meet mourning and where engineering meets human frailty, one can trace how small administrative acts, little decisions about what to answer and whom to wake, became the scaffolding of catastrophe. It was not one monstrous failing, but a confluence of minor ones, the aggregate of human inattention and institutional inadequacy. At the end of that story lies a sober recognition. Machines are not inert. They are fed by social and economic practices. Confidence born on a trial does not equal immunity at sea. Class lines embossed into a ship's architecture can become barriers as soon as the social contract frays, and a radio, when pressed into service for private convenience and profit, can fail to be the sentinel it was intended to be. The disaster that followed was, therefore, not simply the effect of a collision with ice, but the outcome of a network. People, devices, regulations, inclinations, and timing all oriented that night toward a tragic symmetry in which human error matched natural hazard to lethal result. The sea will always be indifferent. Our institutions, less so. They can be remade, learned from, and corrected. But for the passengers and the crew on that maiden voyage, the short season of trial-induced pride and the long architecture of social separation conspired with small communication failures to create a night that would, for generations, remain a warning about the cost of assuming infallibility. At 11:40 p.m. on April the 14th, 1912, in that slow, exquisite blackness of the North Atlantic off Newfoundland, where stars sometimes seem too distant to bother, something touched the hull of the Titanic that would unravel 1,300 tons of human assurance. The night was moonless, and the sea had the peculiar, merciless calm that makes tiny objects look like mountains. Up in the crow's nest, two men, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, watched and waited. They had no binoculars. There had been a key, a name, a bureaucratic shuffle, and the key had gone ashore with an officer who never sailed, so they watched with eyes only. Ice was a word on a wireless at various points that afternoon and evening. Ice reported, good east of Newfoundland. It had become talk, then a cautionary note, then a distant nuisance. Nothing about it suggested catastrophe until Fleet's soft, precise voice cut the air. "Iceberg right ahead." On the bridge there were commands and a small choreography of trained reflexes. The wheel turned. Orders to reverse the engines were given. The great common sense of coal and steel and human will tried to outthink the inevitability of a jagged glacier. The Titanic did not collide with a colossal thunder. There was not the cataclysm some imagined. It was a scrape, a tearing, a shudder that ran along the starboard bow and down the side like a hand drawn slowly over a pane of glass. Passengers felt a tremor, a thud beneath carpets and hearths. Waiters momentarily paused. Glass chimed. In some cabins, someone thought perhaps a heavy wave had struck. In others, men went on with their cigars and the music, not yet knowing how the night would change. Captain Edward J. Smith had been at sea long enough to understand the difference between a nuisance and a leviathan. He also, like everyone else on board, was connected to an industry that sold confidence as a product. Within minutes of the impact, the captain ordered men below to inspect. Thomas Andrews, the ship's builder from Harland and Wolff, hurried forward with a calm that was not theatrical but technical. He carried the blueprints in his head. He went down into the belly of the ship and came up with a verdict that was direct yet horrible in its engineering simplicity. Sections of the starboard bow had been torn. Seams that should never have met the cold Atlantic had met it. Water was seeping, then pouring into the forward compartments. The watertight bulkheads, 16 transverse partitions that in diagrams promised to hold back the ocean, were doing their job for a time. But the ship had been designed in steel and optimism to stay afloat with up to a certain number of compartments flooded. Andrews concluded that the iceberg had riven the hull across more compartments than the vessel could safely lose. He spoke of numbers. He showed the captain the lines on a chart and marked time. 2 hours, he said, perhaps a little less. There was no melodrama in his face, only arithmetic and the bitter certainty of geometry and gravity. That arithmetic was the first of the disasters, the realization that the design's limits and the collision's reality no longer matched. The second disaster was the human response to that realization. For there is always a throat of time between recognition and action, and it was in that throat that optimistic judgment and compartmentalized duty did what they do best: create delay. To declare a full-scale emergency is to authorize chaos. To delay is to hope the situation will behave itself and be patched. Captain Smith and his officers moved as if they were threading a needle rather than tearing the fabric of the ship. They closed watertight doors, they ordered pumps and keyed, and they summoned the officers who would have to execute an evacuation they had seldom practiced. The pumps worked. The men below shifted coal and kept the lights on as long as possible. Steam surged. In the engine room, stokers and firemen kept feeding the furnaces because elevators, telegraphs, lights, and the wireless all relied on the heartbeat of heat below. Those men were given a simple plan: keep the plant running. They kept it running to the bitter, heroic last. Yet the technical evidence, the diagrams that Andrews showed, rendered any optimism a form of denial. The bulkheads did not reach the higher decks. Their tops were intended to take on a static surge of water, not a steady rising river that would pour carefully from one compartment to the next like a line of dominoes toppled by seawater. The ship was, in a way that made engineers shudder, designed to lose battles but not the war. It was not designed to lose the war. And now multiple forward rooms were breached. Men did the things engineers teach you: isolate, pump, shore, calculate mark times. What they did not do was flick a single switch that would deliver salvation. Much of their work bought minutes, and the minutes had to be spent choosing who would survive them. The decision to lower the lifeboats was not a single point, but a series of small negotiations. The first formal instruction to prepare boats came not from a grand design, but from human conversation, from successive officers relaying an assessment that had been pushed forward only as information could be trusted, and there was a cultural backdrop that made the next steps feel unnatural. The unsinkable narrative that had been breathed into the public as marketing and into the crew as institutional pride. If the vessel could be thought unassailable, then filling small boats with a crowd from the decks was an implicit admission of failure. The social nuance, "we do not wish to alarm the ladies," morphed into delay. This reluctance was not necessarily malicious. It was an old maritime ethic that prizes order above frenzy. A commander's hope that discipline could preserve life without producing panic. When the actual raising of the boats began, it became immediately clear that procedure had been an aspiration more than a rehearsal. Titanic carried 20 lifeboats. They were rigid and collapsible, beautifully appointed and terribly inadequate for the number of people. The davits that would lower them required practiced hands and clear commands. The crew had not drilled with that configuration at sea. Orders were shouted across decks and misheard. Lower away meant different things to different men in brittle wind and blinding spray. The angle of the deck as the bow sank made it physically harder to swing boats out and keep them level. The machinery was rudimentary in the sense that it assumed calm and competence. It had not been stressed in training. Men improvised. The officers tried to hold to a rule of the age: women and children first. But which women and which children? And whose interpretation of this code would hold in the frantic minutes that followed? The practical consequences of this improvisation were cruelly visible. Lifeboats left their davits partly filled. One was lowered with perhaps a dozen occupants when its capacity was for 40. Men in blazers and brass buttons used their social weight to board because they were nearby and physically nearer to the boat deck. Others were persuaded off the gangways by gentle or not so gentle hands. Some boats that could have carried dozens left with barely a handful because crew did not insist their passengers sit, because men insisted they would not leave, or because understaffed crews did not know how to take a full load without tipping a boat in the swell. The dissonance between capacity and use was tragic in its bureaucracy. Here was an elegant ship, all measured lifeboat numbers and rescue protocols on paper, behaving in harsh and human ways when the paper was crumpled in haste. The Women and Children First Code, noble in sentiment, revealed its social contours under stress. Many first-class women, rooted by privilege and geography, found their way to the boat deck quickly, and hence survived at higher rates. Third-class passengers, immigrants in steerage, faced locked gates, language barriers, and corridors designed more for segregation than quick egress. They were literally and figuratively lower in the ship. Some quarter gates were indeed closed in the confusion, some were not. Inquiries would later argue about intent, about whether locks were part of a deliberate policy to prevent a stampede, about whether stewards were obeying orders or following panic. The outcome was cruelly predictable. The decks were not an impartial space. First class had means and access. Third class had to negotiate bureaucracy, stairways, and the distrust of English crewmen who could not always translate the urgency of what was happening into languages like Italian, Greek, and Syrian. There were officers who improvised heroically within this disordered system. Second Officer Charles Lightoller enforced a strict form of the women and children only rule on his side of the ship, sometimes to the exasperation and relief of the men who were left behind. First Officer William Murdoch, earlier at the helm during the collision, used discretion under pressure. He allowed some men to board when the boats on his scene risked being underfilled. Other men, like Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, in charge of a boat that later became infamous for refusing to go back to pick up survivors, acted with a mix of fear and rigid command that would make the moral historians argue for a lifetime. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe would later be remembered for returning with an organised crew and a stowaway of moral courage to attempt rescues in the water after the ship went down. He was one of the few who turned a lifeboat around and tried to remedy the earlier scattershot nature of the evacuation. And while officers argued over occupancy and order, the wireless room was a frantic, bitter little theatre of its own. Jack Phillips and his younger assistant Harold Bride were the ship's voice, sending CQD and later SOS into a night that could not be told how near help might be. For hours they worked, their apparatus buzzing and soaking under the strain. They were overloaded with messages, immigrant telegrams for passengers, urgent calls, and the slowly clarifying call for help. There is a small, terrible human image that survives of Phillips bent over his set, sending and sending, while voices at his shoulder begged him to stop and get off. He did not leave. He sent or tried to send till he could not send any more. Bride survived and later would tell what he could, that Phillips was there until the end and that the wireless kept working as long as the power was kept up by men in the stokeholds. They kept the city's lights and the Marconi humming until the cold took them. Those wireless messages, once they reached other ships, made rescue possible. When the RMS Carpathia heard the signal, it had turned toward the coordinates, steaming through a field of ice with cup-and-handle urgency that would later save hundreds. But other ships, notably the SS Californian, were close enough to have been useful, and yet did not act in time. Its wireless operator had turned off for the night, and its captain later said he was unaware of the scope of the disaster when rockets arced into the night. Human systems, wireless and maritime command can be merciful in the abstract and mortal in the details. Amid the engineering calculations and the misapplied rules, there were small human dramas that altered outcomes. There was a social geometry to the boats, where you slept determined where you could go when the ship listed. Rich men in injured finery sometimes gave their life belts to wives. Immigrants clambered up stairwells and hurled themselves into the hands of crew, and some crew members turned from their duties in ways that were both appalling and heroic. The band, 8 men under Wallace Hartley, performed perhaps the most famous act of those hours. Whether they played Nearer, My God to Thee, or the waltzes and reels expected on a liner, their choice to play was tactical as much as spiritual. Music steadied people, kept the cadence of calm, and filled a gap that words could not. They played on the sloping deck as the ship settled lower, notes floating into a sea that would not echo them back. They played until the sound itself could not be maintained, and then stopped and were swallowed by cold and darkness. Their leader, Hartley, died. His violin was recovered later in a leather case sealed in the waves, a small human token amid the iron hull. And then there were those whose choices were quieter and nearer to the practical demands of survival for others. Thomas Andrews spent his last hours moving between decks, tearing open the great fabric of hospitality to create routes to the boats. He gave garments, he advised, he saw the lines on the plans and tried to move people around the one inevitability he could not change, the slope. Isidor and Ida Strauss are the emblem of one moral scene. Ida refused a seat in a boat without her husband, and he refused to take it without her. They sat together on the deck chairs and chose mutual abandonment rather than separate survival. John Jacob Astor, who had squeezed life into the first-class world, available in yachts and New York clubs, was seen trying to get his young wife into a boat. He was last seen helping her into a lifeboat, and then allowing her space and a word that vanished beneath the hull's final moans. Stories like these were compounded by hundreds of lesser-known acts of tenderness and dignity. An embrace, a thrown coat, a child's hand guided by a steward. But the ledger of courage also had columns for failing. Men who were given charge of boats sometimes refused to go back to pick up those in the water because they feared being swamped by a desperate crowd, because they did not have the manpower to manage the overload, or because they felt that their orders had been to preserve those already in their boat. Quartermaster Hitchens, assigned as coxswain to one boat, would later be criticised for not returning. He testified that the men in the water were clogging the boat and that he had to protect the surviving women and children in his charge. There are other moments, passengers who bought tickets across an ocean, and then, when it came to the smallest lifeboat, were told by officers to wait for a later boat that would never arrive. There were men who took seats they might have relinquished. There were also men who gave up theirs with a steady hand and watched the boat they might have boarded recede. Bravery was distributed unevenly, as were the fortunes of the passengers. The lifeboats themselves became islands of luck. Some were crowded and cramped, some drifted, undercrewed, with their occupants wondering what to do and where to go. Few had oars enough to allow skillful manoeuvring. Many were unprovisioned for the cold beyond a smoked tin of biscuits and a flask. The ocean was not a simple hole of water. It was a field of bergs and floes, of small ice like teeth that glittered and cut. The men in the engines had kept heat until their bodies were gone. The wireless men had sent until their hands could no longer find the keys. The band had played until their instruments grew dumb. Those actions, small and human, held back the night for others. As the clock ran on and the bow slid down into the Atlantic, the scale of what had been underestimated became cruelly exact. The Titanic went under at approximately 2:20 a.m. on April 15th. With her went the last chance for many who had been kept below by gates, by ignorance, by geography, and by the social order aboard. When the Carpathia arrived some hours later, steaming through ice and into a dawn that was fragile and cold, it found lifeboats clustered like a child's toy set scattered over a dark plain. Those boats held about 700 people, a fraction of those who had started the voyage. They were dirty and quiet and exhausted. They were also survivors in a numerical sense that had been carved out of administrative failure, social demarcation, and raw human choice. From the wreck that night there emerged a litany of human portraits that historians tell again and again because they teach us the cost of decisions made far from the sea and of habits left unexamined. There were, for instance, the wireless operators, who were both the first and last line of modern salvation. Jack Phillips had rebuked a nearby ship that had warned Titanic of ice earlier in the evening, an exchange captured in testimony as brusque and distracted. Later, after the collision, Phillips and Bride sent distress until the apparatus grew cold. Their dogged attention to the telegraph did not avert the overall disaster, but it was how the call got to the Carpathia, and their work was the sinew that knit the tragedy to rescue. There were white faces and brown faces, well-appointed coats and threadbare sleeves, men who had built fortunes, and men who had crossed for a single hope of a new life. social topography persisted even in extremity. The survivors were more likely to be women in first class than men in steerage. That is not a moral position, but a fact of access and design. It is also where the term arrogance enters the ledger. The arrogance was not always conscious. It was embedded in regulations that required lifeboat space for fewer than half the people on board, in a design chosen for appearance as much as for safety, in a popular culture that assumed technology could work without contingency. Those small decisions, how many boats to carry, how high to make a bulkhead, which offices to trust with a key, converged in one cold Atlantic night into a failure that was as much administrative as elemental. And yet, in that same night, human choice cleaved the broader catastrophe into singular acts. Harold Lowe returned to the zone of wreckage, organised a pickup of survivors, and with the crew of his lifeboat took a small machine and anchored it in the teeth of the current to draw people close. He fired shots into the darkness not to punish, but to make noise that could be triangulated in the confusion. He hauled bodies into small boats and kept them alive by force of will. In other cases, men like Charles Jochin, the chief baker, reputedly survived by clinging to flotsam and keeping warm through movement and a generous consumption of spirits. There were myriad small and astonishing things. Someone breaking a piano open so that the wood would float and make a raft. Stew trunks used as buoys. Sailors throwing ring buoys and tightening hands. The scale of decision-making that night was a test of systems as much as souls. Leaders were expected to marshal not only courage but coordination. They were expected to convert knowledge into action. In too many instances, their knowledge had been incomplete. In others, it was selectively applied. The Titanic's deck, built for promenades and tea and laughter, became in that coldness an arena in which every decision made earlier, by designers, by line managers, by regulatory committees, showed its human consequence. A missing key, a lifeboat chosen for aesthetics over function, a doctrine of do not alarm, they all contributed. The moral of the night is not simple blame. It is an account of how human systems, when stretched, reveal where values were not aligned with reality. There is a small, inexorable irony in the way the Titanic's own machinery and the human economy around it combined to both transmit the alarm and delay the rescue. The wireless that would summon the Carpathia had been a novelty that evening, used for sending personal telegrams and for gossip. The lifeboats that would be lowered with ceremony and class preference were insufficient because laws meant to please a ship's lines did not anticipate a ship sinking. And the men who later claimed they had acted appropriately were, in many cases, doing the best they could in circumstances to which the best preparation had not been applied. That is the soft-hearted historian's final cruelty. Much of what failed that night was a failure to anticipate failure. When the counting was done and the Carpathia steamed south with its survivors toward New York, the faces in the lifeboats were ragged and quiet. Many would never speak in public of the last hours, because the details were private, too painful, or too legally complicated. The inquiries that followed would debate catalogue and culpability, reform and regulation. But for the men and women in those boats, there was no post-mortem that could return the lost. They had in their hands the paper of the ocean. They had the instruments of command and the knowledge that a series of small, avoidable choices had widened the gulf between staying and sinking. There is a lullaby quality to how the story is told now, the band playing soft against the pull of the sea, the wireless operators sitting by their apparatus until there was nothing left to transmit, the captain standing on the bridge as if on a shore of honour. That is comfort in narrative, an avoidance of the bureaucratic and the mechanical that made the disaster so cruel. But the stern truth is administrative as much as elemental. The iceberg was merciless and indifferent. It did nothing personal. The arrogance was ours, a cultural faith in progress that sometimes forgets to train its caretakers, to stock the boats for the many, to make the bulkheads where they must be, to test and test again against the improbable. In the oven of that night, people did what humans do and rose to an immediacy of courage and tenderness. Others were paralysed or protective in ways that would later be judged. When history counts, it prefers heroes and numbers, but the real record from those hours is more human and less tidy. It is the man in the engine room who pumped heat into the sockets until it was cold. It is the band whose last tones greeted a sun they would never see. It is the officer who bought time by enforcing a rule that left some boats empty and others filled. It is the social map that determined where each person could stand and whom they could reach. It is the operator who sent a desperate code and the ship that heard it and obeyed. It is the hairline fracture of a decision, how many lifeboats to carry, whether carrier regulations mattered more than practicality, that in the night took more lives than the ice did. There are nights when the sea offers lessons. This was one of them. And the lesson is, if the historian must be honest and not merely elegiac, prepare for failure as if you expect it to come. When arrogance and economy rule the design of things that safeguard lives, the unexpected becomes the calamity. The Titanic sank because of a glacier's bite, yes, but also because the social and regulatory scaffolding around the ship was not built to stop it from falling when it counted. Men and women made choices under pressure that revealed both nobility and frailty. Those choices, more than the cold or the steel, are why the story continues to be told at night when the world is quiet and the mind can wander through what might have been. The dawn that found the lifeboats and the survivors did so with the indifferent patience of the sea, a slow, pale light, a silver grey that revealed more than comfort. It revealed rigging and ropes, faces turned inward with the exhaustion of the newly bereaved, and the small, steady work of a ship that had made the decision to become a rescue vessel in the middle of the night. Captain Arthur Henry Rostron of the RMS Carpathia had not taken that decision lightly. He had been roused by his wireless operator, Harold Cottam, who had been the messenger and the hinge between two vessels and two worlds. At about 12:25 a.m., on April 15th, 1912, Cottam had received a desperate message from Titanic's wireless. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride doing all they could to flatten their voices over the telegraph to be heard above routine traffic. And then, Rostron had ordered a turn that would place his ship on course through nightmare ice fields toward the dying lights of the world's largest liner. He throttled engines, sent extra stokers to the furnaces, and lit beacons to steer by. There is a kind of decision in the face of calamity that is almost surgical. A captain opts into risk and accepts the tidy, small hazards in order to meet a great one. Rostron opted. He steamed into that long cold. Carpathia arrived into the ragged perimeter of the disaster at dawn. The exact hour matters little to sleep-addled memory. The moment mattered. There were lifeboats by the score, some empty, many full, and survivors clinging to their clothing or to each other. The transfer that followed has the discreet logistics of any well-run emergency, and the quiet improvisations of people trying to stitch something ordinary back together from the extraordinary. The Carpathia was not built to carry an extra 700 souls. Her manifest was already accounted for, her stores measured by meal plans and berths. She took on, in the hours after the sinking, roughly 700 survivors, about 705 to be precise. And with them she took their names, the weight of their grief, the fragments of their lives. The work of bringing them aboard was technical and human in equal measure. Rope ladders were rigged, bosun's chairs lowered, lifeboats drew alongside and were hoisted. Hands, Rostron's crew white-faced perhaps, but professionally disciplined, passed blankets, hot beverages, clothing, while the ship's scant medical personnel began the triage. Hypothermia would claim many seats at that makeshift ward. Shock would keep many eyes vacant for hours. Those aboard the Carpathia were moved into the saloons and salons. People who, hours earlier, had occupied suites or steerage bunks huddled in common spaces for warmth, wrapped in officers' greatcoats and in blankets borrowed from bedding lockers. The ship's staff, steerage attendants, stewardesses, cooks, emptied pantries and cupboards in a kind of culinary generosity that would become a footnote in later obituaries. There is no faster way to redistribute social distinctions than to trade a dinner service for a towel, and to find yourself answering to the same name, survivor. Some personalities stand out in that small, terrible theatre. Margaret Molly Brown, having been placed in lifeboat number 6, worked among women and children to ensure supplies and to cajole a degree of order, and her voice was one of the more public ones left to narrate the night. Second Officer Charles Lightoller, the highest-ranking surviving officer, came aboard with a kind of weary, regimented account. Harold Bride, the junior wireless operator who had lived through Phillips's death at the telegraph key, came aboard with hands raw and with the story of frantic messages. J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, also arrived on Carpathia, an event that would later become a vexed and dramatised moment in papers and inquiries, and he carried with him a private defence and a public ignominy that the press would feed on. These names would be seared into testimony and headlines. For the moment, they were people needing blankets. Carpathia's crew, with exhaustion palpable and the ship's own gear suddenly insufficient, improvised hospital wards and sleeping arrangements, placed bodies on lounges, pulled mattresses into corridors, and turned the dining room into a place of triage. Shipboard medicine in Mark 12 was a mixture of common sense and the limited toolkit of the time. Warm wraps, stimulants, morphine for severe pain, and the calming presence of a physician whose training was as much in shipboard maladies as in battlefield triage. The crew provided hot drinks and hot soups. They washed faces and hands. The ship's purser kept lists. The wireless operator sent messages, scores of them, to shore, and the telegraph became a taut line of rumour and confirmation that moved faster than any steamer. Names, numbers, the simple facts to be rescrutinised and reshaped by editors in New York, Liverpool, Belfast and Southampton. It is important to emphasise the scale of the logistical challenge without indulging in melodrama. A vessel that had the space for a few hundred extra passengers was suddenly the container for more than double that number. The food and the water supplies had been calculated to the day before. They were now a hurried arithmetic of feeding the living and sheltering the cold. Berths were allotted, sheets changed where possible, and the survivors' clothes were burnt or bagged, the protocol for clothing contaminated by blood or ocean. Many of the Carpathia's passengers donated their own clothes to strangers who needed them more. There is a modest heroism in that kind of generosity, the instant reordering of priorities, the shedding of social armour. Equally striking was the way grief and reunion unfolded, with a quiet that belonged to the early morning. Some reunions were simple. Husbands found wives. A child was handed to a parent. Others were not reunions at all but notices, the articulation of absence that would send a human echo into neighbourhoods and towns. The phone in New York's shipping offices began to ring. The word "sunk" arrived in print and on piano wire telegrams and landed like a new law in port cities. Southampton, the port where many of Titanic's crew had signed aboard, would see little processions of wives and mothers and brothers as lists of the missing were compiled and telegraphed. Liverpool, seat of the White Star Line, would receive the press and the fact that a national prestige had been punctured. Belfast, Harland and Wolfe's Great Yard, where Titanic had been assembled, learned that men who had riveted and hammered steel into the ship had now lost sons, brothers and colleagues. New York, the intended destination, received the Carpathia 3 days later, and with it the live accounts that paper columns would gorge upon. Halifax would become, painfully, the repository for many of the recovered dead. Cable ships like the SS Mackay Bennett sent from that port would recover over 300 bodies and take them home to Nova Scotia for identification and burial. There was shock in the press, and it was a global shock, framed by the Telegraph's quick cruelty. Here was a marvel of engineering, proclaimed indestructible by blueprints and brochures, extinguished by ice. The tone of headlines varied by geography, and that variation mattered in the months ahead. New York papers, aggressively sensational, demanded names and sinners. London papers, sitting on an industry that traded on maritime competence and the Empire's intimate relationship with sea travel, were more measured at first, then harder as the witnesses piled up and the discrepancies in accounts could no longer be smoothed. Sympathy and outrage sat next to one another on the same page. Sympathy because people mourned, outrage because a modern public wanted explanation. But the rescue itself, and the small heroism that animated it, also emphasised the scale of institutional failure. Carpathia's voyage had been an admirable improvisation, not a systemic answer. That became brutally obvious as the route of events was traced. Lifeboat capacity had not been calculated to carry everyone aboard. Radio protocols had allowed a wireless to become the difference between life and death. Other ships had been in the area but had not come to immediate assistance. The most infamous of these was the SS Californian, whose captain, Stanley Lord, had stopped for the night among ice and had wireless communications switched off. The Californian's crew would later say they had seen rockets but had not realised their full import. That ambiguity between the human error of inattention and the failing of systems to ensure constant vigilance became a central plank in the criticisms to come. It is a bitterly neat irony that radio, the very technology that could have helped more, had been integrated into maritime practice with rules and gaps that were not made for a true crisis. When the survivors disembarked in New York, and when the Carpathia's wireless operator began sending the litany of evidence ashore, the stage was set for the tribunals. In cities and committees, men and women who had seen the sea in ways that the average citizen had not were called upon to narrate and to judge. 2 investigations in particular would set the tone for official accountability. An American inquiry led by Senator William Alden Smith and a British Board of Trade inquiry presided over by Lord Mersey, John Charles Bigham. The 2 inquiries were not merely courts of fact. They were political theatres in which questions of nationality, commerce, legal doctrine and public confidence were staged and sometimes performed for effect. The American hearings were characteristically robust and combative. Senator Smith, appointed almost immediately as investigator, convened sessions in New York that drew survivors, officers, shipbuilders and executives into a grid of questioning designed to produce crisp answers. There was an American appetite for assigning blame. The loss of life on a grand and public scale demanded someone to carry a responsibility, and American senators were not shy about pressing witnesses with the theatrical insistence of the press. Testimony from second officers like Charles Lightoller, from wireless operators like Harold Bride, and from survivors like Margaret Brown filled the rooms. J. Bruce Ismay's appearance before the committee was one of the most watched moments. He was perceived by many Americans as an emblem of corporate cowardice, a man who had left his ship in its final hours. So many of the American proceedings focused on individual actions, who ordered what, who had left their post, who had made the decisive mistakes, because they were easier to weigh than the moral anatomy of an entire industry. Across the Atlantic, Lord Mersey's British inquiry took on a different tone, legalistic, formal, and, in its conclusions, cautious. The British government had reasons to be cautious. Shipping was a national industry. British prestige and substantial commercial interests counted on the maintenance of public confidence. The Mersey inquiry would spend hours on the precise timetables and on the question of whether Captain Edward John Smith and his officers had been negligent. It accepted, in its final report, a narrative that minimised institutional culpability and emphasised the unforeseen nature of the collision. The conclusion that the sinking was an accident, the result of an iceberg that could not have reasonably been avoided given the circumstances, was comforting to many who wanted a clear closure. It was unsatisfying to others, especially to those who could point to the ship's lifeboat rules, the unheeded warnings, and to management decisions that were more about appearance than safety. Both inquiries, however, performed a necessary function. They exposed systemic failings that had been left unexamined by habit and by regulation. The legal framework that governed safety, especially British Board of Trade rules, had for years tied lifeboat requirements to tonnage rather than to persons. Titanic met the letter of the law by providing as many lifeboats as her tonnage required, not by providing lifeboats for every soul on board. Both inquiries would scold that logic into irrelevance. The US hearings were unsparing in their rhetoric. The British inquiry was more guarded. Yet both produced recommendations that lifeboat capacity be increased to match the ship's full complement of passengers and crew, that wireless telegraphy be manned around the clock with standardised distress protocols, that safety drills and muster stations be not only routine but enforced, and crucially, that an international mechanism be established to monitor the hazard of ice in the North Atlantic. Legal, political and commercial interests wriggled under the weight of accountability. White Star Line had to defend its brand and to limit liability. Its counsel emphasised compliance with existing maritime law and argued against what it saw as ex post facto moralising. The Harland and Wolff shipyard defended its craftsmanship, while the insurers and financiers calculated exposure and reputational damage. The hearings, for all their search for truth, quickly became arenas of defensive posturing. Executives were careful in their phrasing. Marine engineers argued technical points. Captains, those who had survived, offered testimony that sometimes contradicted sailors' recollections. The differing aims of the two inquiries, an American political body eager for blame and a British trade bureaucracy protective of industry, produced reports that could be read to suit a reader's national sympathies. Yet these tribunals did more than point fingers. They created the apparatus for reform. Within a year or two, practical changes followed. The International Ice Patrol was formed under the auspices of the United States, an entity that would patrol the North Atlantic and produce charts and warnings about pack ice. Radio towers and the protocols for wireless telegraphy were reorganized, and the requirement for continuous wireless watch became a near universal rule. Lifeboat regulations were rethought, and the idea that compliance with older formulas was sufficient gave way to a presumption that safety must be proactive rather than merely legalistic. In short, the inquiries, despite their political theatre and their sometimes defensive work, iced the path toward practical improvement. If the inquiries were public and political, the following century's work has been forensic and technical. Engineers and material scientists taking up the question that the early committees could only gesture at. How did the iceberg really do its damage? And why did that damage amplify into a catastrophe of such scale? There have been two broad families of technical explanation that have been debated and tested by experiments and dives. One saw the collision as a series of localized punctures that ruptured plates and allowed water ingress into numbered forward compartments. The other proposed that the shock of the collision had opened the seams between plates and set in motion a progressive failure in which rivets and joints sheared away, unzipping the hull and letting the sea in across a long expanse. The truth, as so often in engineering, was not either or, but both and. The iceberg's scrape produced local punctures and buckled plates, and the material properties of the hull, rivet quality, steel composition, structural design, helped turn an otherwise survivable strike into a cascade. The wreck itself, finally found on September 1st, 1985, by a joint US-French expedition led by Robert Ballard and Jean-Louis Michel, gave a three-dimensional scene to the argument. Resting at roughly 3,800 metres beneath the North Atlantic, the two principal pieces of Titanic, the bow and the stern, lie some 800 metres apart, separated by a field of debris. The bow, a long, rusting wedge, shows a torn, gaping region amid its starboard side that suggests a scrape. The stern's violent folding and collapse told of the last moments when the ship's weight worked against an architecture not designed to be borne upside down. Technological advances, sonar mapping, remotely operated vehicles, deep-sea photography have allowed researchers to examine not only the jagged hull, but also individual rivets and plating fragments recovered from the debris field. Laboratory tests on those fragments became a crucial piece of the story. When metallurgists analysed surviving sections and rivets, certain telling features emerged. The steel used in much of Titanic's hull contained levels of impurities, sulfur and phosphorus, that made it less ductile at the low temperatures of the North Atlantic. That means the metal behaved more like glass than like the kind of steel that bends and absorbs shock. Rivets, made sometimes of raw iron and sometimes of steel depending on a location and cost-saving decisions, showed variable quality. Some brought from the forward parts of the hull had higher slag inclusion and lower tensile strength. They were not monolithic in their excellence. At cold temperatures and under the sudden stress of an impact, these rivets could shear or pop, allowing adjacent plates to separate. Laboratory reconstructions, hammering rivets into plate assemblies and chilling them to simulate the North Atlantic, provided a plausible mechanism by which seams could open in a way that the early designers had not imagined. This is not a comfortable correction to the older narrative that the iceberg merely punched discrete holes. It suggests that the iceberg's scrape was sufficient to initiate a longer, structural unzipping. Yet there is also evidence for punctures. Hull plates at the starboard bow show localised tearing and withdrawal. The contact with the iceberg likely involved a long glancing blow, a rip of 300 feet of scraped and wrecked plating. That long abrasion would have scored multiple small penetrations in the hull and deck plating that, together, accounted for the sudden ingress of water across multiple forward compartments. The watertight bulkheads, designed to contain such flooding, were clever in their time, but imperfect in application. They did not extend high enough, and the placement of openings and service pipes meant that water could migrate when a ship was not perfectly upright. When Titanic's bow took on water, the angle of the hull changed. Compartment tops overtopped one another. The design had assumed that a certain number of adjacent compartments might flood and still leave the ship afloat. The reality of the scrape, widespread structural damage combined with the ship's bow settling, changed the operative geometry of those compartments and nullified the margin of safety. Progressive flooding then makes sense in both a physical and an organisational way. Physically, once one compartment flooded and the bow sank lower, water spilled over the bulkheads and onto the next deck and so on. Structurally, rivets and plates that might have been sound at room temperature and during peacetime operations showed themselves to be vulnerable under unusual strain. Organisationally, design philosophies and commercial decisions, shortcuts in rivet purchase, and acceptance of the Board of Trade regime that tied lifeboats to tonnage rather than people, combined to make the final tally more catastrophic than it might have been. Engineering reconstructions and computational modelling later in the century, finite element analysis, high-resolution simulations of hydrodynamic flows have allowed researchers to recreate the sequence of flooding with greater clarity. They have shown how the angle of impact and the longitudinal nature of the scraping created a pattern of water ingresses that was both rapid and spatially extensive. They have recreated how small failures at rivet lines can grow into large tears under dynamic load. Laboratory tests on rivet materials show shear surfaces and microstructures consistent with brittle fracture, while the plate fragments show bending and delamination consistent with both puncture and seam separation. In the end, the technical story is a story in which material science met human decisions. If the hull had been milled from more ductile steel, and if rivets had been of uniformly higher quality, the iceberg's damage might have been localised and containable. If Titanic's lifeboat complement had been planned for its true carrying capacity, or if the radio had a standing night watch in all nearby ships, or if the Californian's captain had been listening, the casualty count would have been lower. These are the counterfactuals that haunt engineers and ethicists alike. Those what-ifs that illuminate both the small things that can avert disaster and are the grand cultural indulgences that produce it. So this is where the arrogance is finely visible in micro and macro, in the confident assertion of invulnerability, unsinkable in the eyes of some advertisers and in the mind of many passengers, and in institutional habits that confuse compliance with safety. White Star Line had built a showpiece where form often swallowed function. Maritime law had long allowed carriers to trade safety margins against commercial routine. Shipbuilding economies introduced variability in materials that would not be acceptable in later decades. The sea will always be indifferent. What Titanic taught the world is that arrogance, corporate, technological and human, can make that indifference lethal. The rescue by the Carpathia, the inquiries that followed, and the century of technical reappraisal that has never really stopped are a single arc of human response. First, people did what people do when lives were at stake. They moved, they warmed, they fed, they sheltered. Then institutions, embarrassed and grieving, called witnesses and shuffled documents, seeking to allocate blame and to reassert control over an uncertain world. Then scientists and engineers spent decades pulling apart rivets and running simulations in the sober company of mathematics and metallurgy. Each phase revealed a layer of what happened and of why. Brave captains and generous crews, legal frameworks that failed to match the new scale of technology, materials that, at the wrong temperature and with the wrong inclusions, could betray an entire structure. It would be tidy to choose a single villain. Instead, the disaster reads like a ledger of many small misjudgments and a few great miscalculations, a ledger balanced in a way that is instructive and expensive. There are further ironies that the years have emphasised. Many of the reforms recommended in the wake of Titanic, lifeboat drills, radio watches, the International Ice Patrol, would save lives in the decades to come. The industry adapted. But adaptation is not repentance. It is the pragmatic acceptance that the cost of learning the hard way is high. The inquiries, in trimming through testimony and torn documents, did their job of pressuring regulation into life, even while they shielded some reputations. The engineers and metallurgists, wrestling with the corroded plates dredged from the deep, have learned that human systems are brittle in the way that metals are. They suffer fatigue, they fail at seams, they give way where the load is concentrated and where the people in charge assume the load would never come. At the end of this long consideration, there is still a simple, arresting fact. On a cold night in April 1912, an iceberg and a luxurious ship met, and people paid with their lives. The relief that arrived with Captain Rostron and the Carpathia's crew, the lists compiled by senators and by peers, the forensic microscopes that examined slag inclusions and fracture surfaces, all of it points to the same conclusion. It takes little across the sea to turn confidence into calamity when brittle materials, deficient safety practices, and institutional complacency converge. That convergence was not inevitable. It was preventable in small, practical ways. More lifeboats, more vigilant radio watches, better quality control on rivets, and an appetite for safety that outstripped the appetite for publicity. As you let that thought drift into the margin of memory, remember too the quiet humanity of the rescue. Strangers giving coats to strangers, cooks turning soup kettles into instruments of salvation, and a captain who ordered his ship to run through ice to pick up the living. There is a grim humour in the fact that much of what saved lives afterward was not the pride of great companies but the improvisation of sailors and the indignation of lawmakers. The Titanic sank because human systems failed under stress and because the sea will not forgive mathematics that lack margins. The Carpathia answered with blankets and hot tea. The world answered with laws and laboratories. The steel beneath the ocean answered with rust and testimony. Tonight, in the hush of the telling, the lesson sits like a small, firm stone. Technology can be a shield or a wound, depending on how soberly it is wielded. When we pretend infallibility, the sea will be quick to correct us. And when it corrects, we have choices to learn and legislate, to test and improve, to leave the idle rhetoric of invincibility behind. The survivors on the Carpathia taught the simplest lesson of all, that when disaster comes, ordinary kindness and competent logistics can save lives. The inquiries taught that laws must catch up with scale, and the engineers taught that the smallest alloy decisions can upend the largest ambitions. Sleep now with that measured knowledge. The world learned painfully that arrogance can be converted into safety if we are willing to replace hubris with hard, continuing work. The blackness at the bottom of the North Atlantic has a patience older than nations and a memory that, in its own way, is as exacting as any courtroom. And on a still September night in 1985, its memory gave up a secret it had kept since 1912. Robert Ballard, the oceanographer whose name has come to stand for deep-sea discovery, stood under that cold, indifferent skier aboard the American research vessel Nor, while a French colleague worked from Le Suroît. The teams were armed not with melodrama but with instruments, side-scan sonar, towed camera sleds, meticulous plotting sheets, and the quiet obsession that keeps historians awake, and with a remote vehicle called Argo that sent back a thin ribbon of light and grainy images down through 12,000 feet of water. The mission wore two faces. Officially it was scientific exploration. Under the paperwork and the press briefings, there was a private understanding with the United States Navy, which had funded part of the operation so that Ballard could test techniques useful for locating lost submarines, Thresher and Scorpion among them. That secrecy gave the expedition access. It also later complicated the moral ledger of discovery. It is a small bitter irony that much of what we learned about the most famous peacetime shipwreck came only because military authorities wanted to look for military losses. When Argo began to whisper back images, They were not, at first, of a great whole ship lying like a corpse beneath a courthouse of water. They were of fragments, a scatter of white shapes that could have been driftwood, a glint or two that might have been metal, a smear that looked for all the world like porcelain. Ballard and his team followed the debris field as if it were a breadcrumb trail leading to a larger narrative, because by now the idea was established among wreck hunters that a story at the surface leaves a spoor below. The sled moved slowly, the cameras playing the same trick a lighthouse used to play on the human eye, a narrow cone of brightness that made a cathedral-sized object appear at once intimate and unreachable. Then the bow came into view, and for those who were not already historians, it looked like a myth suddenly made spatial. The prow rose from the black like a cathedral transept, the name faintly legible, the anchor chains draped in a quiet gravity. The plating bowed and rusted, but intact enough to say plainly to anyone who had been paying attention that something enormous had broken and then been rearranged by forces both violent and inexorable. The discovery, made publicly on September the 1st, 1985, did more than produce pictures for the front pages. It complicated and in some respects simplified a century of argument. Ballard and the French teams, Jean-Louis Michel and his IFREMER, French Institute for Research and Exploitation of the Sea colleagues, were working in parallel, and the two nations' efforts, overlaid like maps, gave the world both corroboration and competition. Found that the wreck lay in two large pieces separated by a debris field that stretched for hundreds of metres. The bow lay relatively intact. The stern, when it appeared, was a ruin, a chiaroscuro of twisted steel and gaping furnace rooms, as if the back half of the ship had been a theatre set ripped off stage and flung aside. The two pieces sat some 600 metres apart, a distance that would ultimately help historians and engineers map the terrible sequence that had unfolded in the last minutes on April night in 1912. That physical separation, photographed, measured and mapped, settled one of the long, petty debates that had hung over Titanic scholarship. Did the great ship sink in one piece, as some official testimony had suggested, or did it break in two? The sea, at its own unhurried pace, had preserved a truth that words and witnesses had been unable to fix. Survivors had given contradictory accounts. The rescuers, dazzled and exhausted, had misread what darkness and distance had shown them. The ocean, by laying out the wreck's geometry, gave historians the ability to reconcile memoirs with mechanics. It was not only the fact of a break that the deep revealed. The wreck and its scattered contents told a more detailed structural story. Photographs and video showed how the midsection had been torn apart, plating peeled like the skin from an orange, rivets sheared, bulkheads twisted. The bow section's intactness was deceptive. It was preserved in a frozen posture of violent forward motion, and the stern's disintegration offered a catalogue of what happens when internal stresses overcome metal designed to hold under different conditions. Later, when salvage operations brought fragments up for laboratory testing, materials scientists such as Tim Folk and others examined samples of rivets and plate and raised questions about the composition of some of the iron used in Titanic's construction, suggesting that impure iron and the metallurgy of the time may have contributed to brittle fracture under the shock of collision and the shock of rapid unloading. No single explanation, human error, ice, poor steering or flawed rivet, suffices. The wreck insists on a distributed causality, and the geography of debris is the field on which those causes can be weighed against one another. Mapping the debris field transformed the practice of maritime historiography. Where before one relied on testimony, tour diaries and scrapings from official transcripts, now one had a kind of physical ledger. The positions of lifeboats, the scatter of china and clothing, the places where windows and staircases came apart. Photogrammetry, three-dimensional plotting, and the patient cataloguing of artefacts permitted scholars to reconstruct not just the moment of impact, but the choreography of evacuation and collapse. The grand staircase, the second-class library, the opulence that had been aboard, these were rendered as data points. The presence of deck chairs, personal effects, and even entire pieces of furniture among engine parts and coal spoke to the ship's interior spaces being ripped apart in a way that the hearings after the disaster had only dimly apprehended. For the first time, archaeology of a 20th century disaster had the resources to treat an industrial, civilized object as an archaeological site rather than as a mere cache of treasure. That reconception brought with it hard, sometimes bitter, questions about ownership and ethics. A wreck in international waters raises messy legal issues. Titanic lay a long way off Newfoundland and out of any single nation's jurisdiction, so legal claims fell into the complicated jurisprudence of admiralty law. The first salvage companies came relatively quickly. There was an American entity, RMS Titanic Inc., that laid claim to salvage and then to exclusive rights to bring artefacts to the surface, and with salvage came exhibition. Courtrooms in the United States parcelled out a kind of limited custody and salvage rights, recognising the company's finder's interest but also imposing duties of preservation and documentation. Archaeologists protested the commodification of a site that many considered a maritime grave, and families of the dead argued that photographing and selling trinkets from a seafloor cemetery was a form of desecration. UNESCO's 2001 Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage would later lay down international principles discouraging commercial exploitation and advocating for in situ preservation where feasible, but not every country is a signatory and not every legal framework easily retrofits to a wreck already under active salvage. These legal battles shade into ethical ones. Is it better to leave the wreck untouched and let the ocean take its due? Or to recover artefacts that will be conserved and exhibited, thereby allowing the public to confront the story in a tangible way? Opponents of salvage argued that the site should be treated with the same sanctity afforded to terrestrial war cemeteries. Proponents argued that raising and conserving objects preserved them from the ravaging action of microbes and metal-eating organisms, rusticles and bacteria that were not fully understood in 1985 but which later researchers would name and study. In a cruel, minute justice, the wreck that had been built of iron and English pride had become over the decades food for the sea. Rusticles, those dripping stalactites of rust that hang from Titanic's ribs, are the work of microorganisms, and in 2010 scientists isolated a bacterium now known as Halomonas titanicae that feasts on iron, promising to render the wreck into a skeleton in a few more decades if nothing were done. That biological alarm has softened the purists' arguments in some quarters. To many, recovery now looks less like trophy hunting than like rescue, rescuing objects that would otherwise dilute into sediment and bacterial stew. Yet rescue itself is not a morally pure business. It is freighted with choices. Who decides which objects are raised and displayed? Who interprets them, and to what purpose? The American salvage company's exhibitions would travel the world, turning door latches and plates into instruments of instruction and commerce. Museums and travelling shows framed artefacts as relics of a moral tale. For archaeologists, the insistence on meticulous recording, cataloguing each find against its exact position in the debris field, taking high-resolution imagery, establishing chains of custody, was an attempt at discipline against profit-driven salvage that selected for spectacle rather than for context. James Cameron, who would later become famous for bringing Titanic narratives to billions of cinema seats, also contributed to the mapping and filming of the wreck in the 90s, using the Soviet-built Mir submersibles to create detailed visual records. His approach, cinematic and reverent in his own way, underscored a modern truth. The line between documentation and display is thin, and every expedition to the site will be accused either of desecration or of neglect, depending on the politics of preservation that blooms around it. What the ocean gave up in 1985 therefore did more than answer technical questions. It forced a rethinking of how modern societies treat sites of mass death in the age of spectacle and marketable nostalgia, and that rethinking moved swiftly into the realm of myth. The Titanic was already a story before it was found, a narrative shaped by journalists, by the litigation that followed the sinking, by authors who chewed on its bones for meaning. Morgan Robertson's eerie 1898 novella Futility, with a fictional ship called Titan striking an iceberg, would be later read as prophetic, though it is more likely coincidence reinforced by the hindsight. The raw material of the disaster, a big new technology, the visible inequality aboard ship, the personalities of men like J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line who survived and who became a symbol of cowardice in the public imagination, and Captain Edward John Smith, who went down with his ship, was irresistible to journalists and moralists who wanted to make of the event a parable. In the months after April 1912, newspapers and parliamentary hearings sought names to place on a ledger. Ismay, who had taken a seat on a lifeboat and whose public reputation would be scarred by the act. The Californian's captain, Stanley Lord, accused and defended in the endless rhetorical tug-of-war about whether his ship was close enough and whether his officers had failed to respond to distress rockets, the shipbuilders Harland and Wolff in Belfast, the designers at White Star Line in Liverpool, the wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, who had continued to tap out messages until the end. The British Board of Trade and the US Senate held inquiries. Transcripts piled up and made the disaster fit, however uneasily, into the legal frameworks of blame and liability. From these hearings, newspapers lifted portraits and bullet points that were easier to grasp than the slow, cumulative logic of structural failure. The story needed villains, and the modern press was willing to supply them. That willingness to simplify did not stop in 1912. It was the engine of Titanic's cultural afterlife. Walter Lord's A Night to Remember, a book published in 1955, returned the narrative to sober human terms and became itself a kind of canonical account, later adapted into the 1958 British film of the same name, which prized procedural fidelity and the dignity of small acts. Lord's chronicle did not indulge in oversimple moralising. It resurrected the human geography of that night and helped restore some respect to the voices of the many rather than the few. But by the time the late 20th century rolled around, the Titanic had accrued a multitude of lenses. The story was irresistible to political propagandists. The Nazis used the ship as a metaphor for capitalist greed in a 1943 German film, and communists elsewhere used the narrative to critique bourgeois excess. In art and literature, the ship became a mutable emblem of hubris, of the vulnerability of modernity, of class conflict. In music and theatre, the tale was recycled and repackaged. The Broadway musical Titanic, a theatrical project that won awards in the 1990s, turned accounts of names and jobs into a communal elegy, and tourists now stood in museums to peer at preserved belongings that made the tragedy tactile. Then there was the enormous re-entry of Titanic into popular consciousness in 1997, when James Cameron's film, which mingled painstaking archival detail with a fictional love story between two invented characters, Jack and Rose, turned the moral and technical story once more into myth for a vast audience. Cameron's film did something subtle. It used spectacle to insist upon intimacy, and it made class into narrative, with first-class grandeur and third-class humanity filmed in the same emotional key, so that viewers could, for a few hours, experience the moral freight of the night. It also commodified the image of the wreck, and its success helped to ensure that Titanic would ever after be a staple of both education and entertainment. What had been a complicated affair of engineering, regulation and seamanship became, through repeated retellings, a parable, technological arrogance punished, hubris humbled. There is dark humour in how insistently the Titanic is used as a shorthand. Corporations brand a failed project a Titanic moment when stakes are high. Pundits invoke the ship to criticise everything from financial institutions to technology platforms, and politicians deploy the metaphor to dramatise leadership failures. The shorthand is effective precisely because the public already has a ready-made moral structure. Unsinkable arrogance meets natural or moral retribution. But such simplicity masks the slow, systemic realities that the wreck teaches us. Disasters are rarely the work of single villainies. They are instead the accumulation of normal practices and tolerated risks. The myth makes for an arresting headline and a memorable film scene. The history makes for better policy, and policy, after all, is where much of Titanic's practical legacy resides. The shock of 1912 produced immediate and enduring changes. Within months, the rhetoric of inquiry had hardened into international action. The Radio Act in the United States was rethought. wireless communication went from novelty to regulated necessity. The idea that ships needed to maintain around-the-clock wireless watch, that distress messages should be standardized, that assistance should be coordinated, these were lessons coded into laws and practices. The International Ice Patrol was established under the aegis of the United States Coast Guard in 1914 as a multinational response to the hazard the North Atlantic ice posed to transatlantic shipping. Aircraft and later radar and satellite surveillance would begin to track iceberg fields for the safety of all mariners. The first International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, was convened in the immediate aftermath in 1914 to codify measures such as sufficient lifeboat capacity and better evacuation rules. War intervened, and implementation took time and iterations, but the new international architecture of maritime safety, successive SOLAS conventions culminating in modern, broadly ratified codes under the International Maritime Organization, is a direct child of the Titanic's lessons. The most visible rule is simple and shamefully obvious. Lifeboats for everyone. Ships would no longer be allowed to calculate lifeboat numbers by tonnage rather than by heads aboard. Lifeboat drills, muster stations, and equipment checks became routine, and the culture of seafaring began slowly to tilt toward an expectation of preparedness rather than a faith in grace. Radio watches and distress protocols, SOS, continuous monitoring, meant that cries for help would have a greater chance of being heard. The Ice Patrol established fixed reporting lines and a steady gaze on one of the childish hazards of nature, ice that, in the wrong place and the wrong size, could convert a proud novelty into a funeral pyre. These were not merely technical fixes, they were cultural corrections. They taught that technology without procedures is an invitation to catastrophe, and that the chains of responsibility necessarily include regulators, designers, and operators, not only captains and a few heroic figures. Yet regulation is not a cure-all. It is possible to write rules that look good on paper, and then to watch people trample them because practice has different pressures. The Titanic's enduring lesson is therefore less the list of new rules than the ethic behind them. That accountability must be continuous, that humility must be built into design and culture. Newer instruments, the International Safety Management Code, improved classification standards, human factors engineering, are attempts to make safety not a boxed check but a raison d'etre for organisations that traffic in risk. The tragedies that follow when safety is subordinated to schedule or profit in shipping and elsewhere often bear a family resemblance to the Titanic. Rushed decisions, ignored warnings, faith in the machine to do what the people around it cannot. Public memory and memorialisation are part of the same story. In Halifax, Nova Scotia, where many of the dead were brought and buried, gravestones stand under indifferent Canadian skies. Fairview Lawn Cemetery is a place where names and numbers are arrayed, as if to make grief legible. Southampton keeps an engineer's memorial to the men who kept the lights on as the ship sank. Belfast, where Titanic was built at Harland and Wolff, has transformed shipyards into a museum and interpretive complex, Titanic Belfast, which opened for the centenary of the wreck and turned industrial pride into reflection. Monuments and museums are not mere sentimentalism. They are civic commitments to remember what institutions learned the hard way. They signal that nations and industries have to carry with them the memory of failure as ballast for future ambition. So the last word is not a moralistic one, but a practical lulling insistence. The Titanic's greatest inheritance is not merely the story of hubris, nor the gallery of named villains and heroes, but a continual invitation to keep asking uncomfortable questions about how our systems are organised. The ship was a triumph of engineering and a testament to industrial capacity. It was also, in its fateful night, a lesson in how the best tools can be turned against their makers when the human element is assumed away. We have improved the hard parts: lifeboats, radios, ice patrols, international conventions. We have improved the soft parts too: training regimes, regulatory cultures, and, sometimes, the humility of managers who must choose between pride and prudence. But the sea has not grown any kinder, and the machine of modernity still produces surprises because it is made by fallible people. At the end, When the sea has done with its slow, opaque work, and when courts and museums have weighed the objects and the ethics, the story of Titanic asks us to remember a simpler fact that is easily obscured by spectacle. Technologies are not moral agents. People are. Ships do not decide to be arrogant. Companies do not decide to be reckless. Governments do not decide to usurp the caution of engineers. We do. To remember Titanic is to remember that every age must make its own bargains between daring and care, and that memory matters as a corrective. So we keep the pictures of the bow and stern and the mapped debris field. We keep the artefacts in vitrines and the names on stones. We teach the procedures and we fly the patrol planes. We tell the story again to our children in a soft voice, so they will sleep with more wisdom than their parents did, and so that perhaps they will be less willing to let arrogance do what regulation cannot always prevent. The ship that sank in 1912 still speaks. Its rusticles drip on like punctuation. We listen. We build a little better. We try again to be smaller in our pride.